genre.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the We Deserve Better Anti-Violence Advocacy Summit. My name is Damari, or Dee, and I am one of the co-founders of the SOAR Collective. I am a pale, mixed race Latina woman with short, dark, curly hair, and I am against a beige background with a cat painting above me. We are so excited for all of you who are making the time to join us today for part one, the state of advocacy. During today's webinar, we have ASL interpretation available as well as closed captioning. You can choose to view or hide the captions using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. If you're having any trouble using Zoom, you can live stream the event at youtube.com/@the-SOAR Collective. Feel free to message our panelists and co-hosts for tech support throughout the webinar. And thank you to our interpreters and captioners for helping us make this event accessible. And we'd like to quickly take a moment to thank our donors and sponsors. We had a few donations from generous individuals, as well as support from the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault, whose sponsorship helped fund ASL interpretation today, and RAFT, which stands for Resilience for Advocates through Foundational Training, who has amazing resources for advocates. All right, what to expect. So today is part one of a three-part series. The other two webinars will be held on June 2nd and June 16th. Today, we'll give a first overview of who we are and why we embarked on this journey to hear about the experiences of anti-violence advocates across the United States. We'll be sharing back high-level key findings, and we'll take a short break around 3 p.m. Eastern before wrapping up the findings and diving into Q&A. We'll end by sharing next steps and share some great resources. And we'll be turning the chat function on at certain times. You can always use the reaction buttons, which are at the bottom. And we also encourage you to add questions to the Q&A tab. And you can upvote questions others have submitted. We are recording this webinar, and anything you share in the chat will be available to view with the recording. We will share out the recording and the slides in the upcoming weeks. And today I'm joined by my SOAR Collective co-founders and friends, and I would like them to introduce themselves now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tatiana Piper. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm located in my home in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a cis Black woman with medium-length curly black hair, pink glasses, and I'm wearing a floral white tank top with a blurred background behind me. You might occasionally hear tiny little baby noises or see a little bobbling head every now and then. And I'll pass it to Jackie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Strom. I use she, her pronouns and am located in my home office in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I'm a cis white woman with medium length, dark curly hair, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. I have brightly colored floral wallpaper behind me. So the SOAR Collective is just the three of us, and we are anti-violence advocates who are ready for change, ready for a revolution, and ready to hold organizations accountable. We continue to hear about the pain, disappointment, frustration, and discrimination advocates experience on a daily basis. And we can relate because we've experienced it ourselves too. So we aim to mobilize advocates to demand accountability and revolutionize the way that anti-violence organizations operate. And so at this time, I'm going to pass it over to Joe for some more introductions.
Hi, everyone. Joe, my pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Chicago. I'm a white cis woman with short brown hair, nose piercing, and very bright red lipstick, and a black sort of turtleneck. And I will pass it over to Sierra to introduce herself.
Sierra, we're actually having some trouble hearing you. And so in the meantime, maybe we can pass it over to Merlin.
Hello, my name is Merlin. I use he, him, or she, her pronouns. I am a digital strategist with Survivors Know and a member of the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle. I am a queer AMAB person with a beard and medium long light brown hair, a red top, and red lipsticks. So we are with, Joe and I are with Survivors Know. We are an organizing action hub. As survivors of power-based sexual violence ourselves, we organize, challenge the status quo, and create alternatives to the systems that fail us. We couple trauma-informed labor organizing with survivor justice to address our wholeness as survivors. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this to Sarah, who is also with MAVSC.
Thanks, Merlin. Hey, y'all, I'm Sarah Ferrato, she, her, they, them pronouns, and I am with the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle. My full-time position is at the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I'm located in my dining room / book nook in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I'm a white, gender fluid person with longish, brown, highlighted, wavy hair, wearing a black blazer and gold earrings. I have shelves of books behind me, and I've been a member of MAVSC for just over a year, and in the anti-violence prevention field professionally and unprofessionally for over a decade. And I'll pass it over to Sierra.
Fortunately, Sierra, we're still having trouble hearing you. So, okay, Sierra's gonna rejoin us in just a second. And I'm wondering, Sarah, if you'd be able to share a little bit more about MAVSC.
Yeah, definitely. This is Sarah. The Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle is a community of anti-violence advocates who are dedicated to survivor-centered advocacy and community partnership. We're centered in anti-capitalist, anti-carceral values, and are committed to providing resource alternatives to survivors, each other, and in our own communities. So I think we're going to talk about the goals and purpose of the evaluation we're all here to talk about today, while Sierra is rejoining us.
This is Jackie. So Survivors Know, MAVSC, and the SOAR Collective collaborated with the goal of learning more about the experiences of current and former anti-violence advocates. And so the two questions that we hope to answer are the ones on the screen, which are, what are the primary challenges advocates experience while working in the anti-violence field? And what changes can anti-violence agencies make to support advocates and survivors and improve systems? And so we asked advocates to complete an assessment between the end of November 2022 through the middle of January of this year. And since then, we've been analyzing the data and working on this webinar series. And we want to express our gratitude to everyone who completed the assessment. You shared your stories with us, and we hope we're able to honor your experiences and that you feel validated by the data and know that you're not alone. And as Dee said earlier today, we're going to be focusing on the overall themes and high-level findings. And so we hope that you'll be able to join us for webinar 2, which is on June 2nd, where we'll look more specifically at the continual and emergent issues that advocates face, as well as webinar 3 on June 16th, where we're going to get together with all of you to brainstorm solutions and create action steps. So I'll just quickly see if Sierra is able to introduce herself.
Is my mic working? Woo!
We can hear you.
Celebration! Thank you for jumping in. Oops, I don't have my video on. Sorry about that. This is what collective, being in a collective looks like, and I really appreciate you. Hi, everyone. I am Sierra Olivia Thomas Williams, and I am a queer, cis, fat, Doye Asa, which means woman of the people. My skin is olive-ish, and I'm wearing a navy blue shirt and glasses, and I have longish black and silver hair. I'm joining you from my home office, and I've got my wild thing looking over my shoulder, making sure everything's okay. And I have been part of the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle from since 2022. And I've been working in the movement for 24 years since 1998, and I joined the movement as a survivor activist. So thank you for letting me introduce myself. And I think we are moving on to our first chat question. And so we're going to open the chat now to everybody so you all can ponder and answer this question. We're really looking forward to getting to know you a little bit. So we want to ask you to say in the chat, what would you say to your younger self on the first day in advocacy? I'll repeat that. What would you say to your younger self on their first day in advocacy? And while you're sharing your responses, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Tatiana to reflect back some of the things we're hearing and take us through some space making today.
This is Tatiana. Thank you, Sierra. Before we go any further, we wanted to go over some community agreements. First, we wanted to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and we will be made accessible to others here and otherwise. So although the needs assessment feedback is confidential, as well as the polling responses, what is stated in the chat will live with the recording. As we convene as a group, we hope that you all will make a few commitments with us. The first is to commit with us to collective decision-making. Our work is your work, and your work is ours, especially as we move into the next 2 webinars. We hope that you agree to be brave and authentic as able, and also acknowledge, due to identity and intersectionality, that this looks and feels different to us all. We ask that you commit with us to value, support, and uplift each other, because if we don't have each other's back in this movement, who will? And lastly, we hope that you commit to our overall goal to change the anti-violence field for the benefit of all. So if you agree to these commitment statements, please use a thumbs up or heart reaction to show your agreement. And those are located at the bottom of your toolbar. Thank you all for committing with us. So I'm going to take some time to go through some of the responses. It might take me a minute as things come through, but we have, you are enough. Believe that you have something important to say. Oh, your boundaries are important and you don't have to do everything that's asked of you. You are not there to solve every problem, but to support, provide resources, and listen. I think I might need to take that one home with me or post it somewhere in my home. Just because the anti-violence movement is supposed to know how to do better and be trauma-informed, that doesn't mean that it actually lives up to that. Yeah, really speaking to some of that institutional betrayal that I know I feel and I've heard others feel too. You belong here. You have value to offer. Uh, I feel like I need a moment in just that one. And I'm going to repeat it. You belong here and you have value to offer. I feel like we could just end on that, but we're not going to. The other one says that you don't have to be available at all times. Turn off your work email notifications. It's not an emergency. I think that's a really good reminder. I used to work with someone, very lovely someone who used to say exactly that, like it is not your emergency. And that reminder is so powerful. And lastly, boundaries are important. Absolutely. And so thank you all for participating. I feel like some of these, although we designed the question for our younger selves, I feel like they totally apply to our current selves. And I show gratitude to you all. And so I'll now pass it over to Jackie.
Thanks, Tatiana. Hi, everyone. This is Jackie. So as we've already stated, we asked advocates to complete an anonymous assessment, sharing their experiences working in the anti-violence movement. And we were truly blown away by the responses that we got. We knew that we wanted to open this assessment to anyone who recently had worked at or was currently working at a victim service organization. So this meant we weren't only looking for responses from what you might traditionally think of as an advocate who works directly with survivors of violence, but other roles within these agencies too, like prevention educators, volunteer coordinators, and even financial or administrative staff. We had a goal of receiving 50 responses, and we're thrilled to receive 265 responses from 31 US states and 2 US territories. So you can see here where it's colored in orange on the map. We received almost a quarter of responses from advocates in Ohio, followed by 16% from advocates in Pennsylvania, 11% from folks in Wisconsin, 8% in Alaska, and 5% from both Indiana and West Virginia. So the SOAR Collective, we're located in Pennsylvania, and Survivors Know has the highest membership in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. And so based on our networks, more responses from these locations made sense to us. The majority of responses, about 80%, are advocates that were still employed at an anti-violence agency, while the other 20% indicated that they were no longer involved with their former agency or being paid by their former agency. But we know that some former advocates really want to volunteer or stay involved in the movement in some way. So we asked them to differentiate if they were still involved in some capacity, and almost 13% were, while the other 7% were not. Nearly half of the respondents currently said that they work at, or most recently had worked at, a dual agency that provided services for survivors of both domestic violence and sexual assault. Almost a quarter of our respondents work at or did work at a rape crisis center. About 12% come from a state or territory coalition. About 9% indicated other, and almost 7% are from an agency that primarily serves domestic violence survivors. We also asked some optional social identity questions to learn more about the characteristics of advocates who completed the assessment. And so I just want to be clear, not everybody answered these questions, so keep that in mind when you're hearing what we say next. Unsurprisingly, based on what we know about the makeup of this field, the majority of respondents who did share with us their gender identity and race on the survey identify as white women. Additionally, many of the respondents who disclosed their age are in the 25 to 34 age bracket. We also had 86 respondents who identified as part of the queer community, 65 respondents who shared that they experienced chronic illness, and 60 respondents who identified as neurodivergent, disabled, or as a person with a disability. As it is with anything, our assessment had limitations, and for transparency and accountability, we want to talk about it. So one limitation is that we had originally planned to ask about the role of each respondent, but we're humans and we launched the survey for a few weeks before realizing that this question had been omitted. And so this is an error on our part, and we really do regret not having this additional data to provide further context. Another limitation was that we did not provide more options for those working more than 15 years in both questions that were related to the length of time that advocates had been in the movement or at their job. And so one survey respondent commented, "I wish the longevity questions didn't stop at more than 15 years. There is a legacy worth capturing and acknowledging the intergenerational compositions of groups and nonprofits in the field. This survey doesn't seem to include questions about leadership positions or folks with longevity in the movement." Some of the language that we used for response options also led to more confusion when we were analyzing the data. So for example, we combined homophobia and transphobia into one option, even though these are different experiences. A handful of respondents also let us know that they left their agency due to moving, because they got a new job, or because they retired. And so one of the respondents actually commented saying, "Retirement should have been one of the options to begin with. All of the above choices are negative. There are positive reasons to leave an organization too." And due to the social identity data provided by some respondents, we know that we should have been more intentional with our outreach to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color in the movement. And so in future surveys, we will make sure to address these limitations, and we really just thank you for your grace. Many advocates expressed deep gratitude for this survey, and we really do take the responsibility of what you've shared with us very seriously. And not only do we hope that you feel heard and validated, but hope that this data provides a foundation to jumpstart us into action. One advocate from Illinois shared, "I'm glad there's finally a more formal report that is being created for anti-violence advocates and workers. So many people feel unheard and leave the anti-violence field as resentful and jaded. Although organizations talk about self-care and burnout often, it is harder to advocate to leadership without concrete data, research, and evidence from recent years." And so before we dive into the key findings, we need to be clear that the issues identified from this survey by advocates are not isolated to a few agencies, but instead demonstrate systemic patterns and are reflective of the culture of many anti-violence agencies across the United States. And so we would like to acknowledge that throughout the entire survey, there were a small few respondents who indicated that they do not experience challenges at their agency and that they have enough resources. And so we want to validate that there are workplaces who do support their employees and create a positive agency culture. And so while the data reflects that this is not the norm, in the future, we really do hope to learn from leaders and agencies who are getting it right. And one person shared with us, quote, "Honestly, my organization is great. We've gotten lucky with having understanding leadership that works to create and enforce policies to help both clients and staff. However, I have heard of other sister agencies within our state that do not have good leadership, affecting the services provided in areas that truly need it." And so at this point in time, I am going to turn it over to Tatiana to really dig into the findings.
Hi, this is Tatiana. First, we want to preface that we've grouped the key findings into 4 main themes or buckets, as we've been calling them. And they include advocates, leadership and organizations, survivors, and systems. So to start us off, we're going to talk about advocates and our passion, inspiration, and commitment to survivors. The first key finding is advocates are deeply passionate about creating safe and thriving communities and are committed to supporting survivors in every way they can. And so we hope that the quotes on the screen give you a heartfelt sense of how advocates show up to support survivors. One quote that really stood out to us was from an advocate in Pennsylvania who said, "In my time as a DVSA counselor, one of the things that kept me in the field for so long was the power that I saw displayed in each and every one of the survivors I had the honor of caring for. The agency I worked for made strong efforts to care for all survivors of every race, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity." Some additional quotes come from an advocate from Nevada who said that advocates are the lifeblood and they are incredibly dedicated. They should be paid much more and not churned and burned through. Another advocate from Pennsylvania said, "There are a good amount of staff who are doing the on-the-ground work that are phenomenal and have strong trauma-informed background and a true heart for the work they do. With these great folks on staff, the individuals we serve feel supported and seen, and that their needs are being met." And lastly, another advocate from Pennsylvania said, "Advocates are fierce and passionate and find a way to support survivors even when they do not have the support from the systems that are supposed to support them." There are several reasons why advocates decide to get into this line of work. 82% wanted to advocate for others, 78% wanted to help people, 70% wanted to create systems change, 60% identify as a survivor of violence, 49% have someone close to them who has experienced violence. So it's important to note that in this question, participants were able to check more than one answer. But the sentiment remains that most advocates are inspired to get into this line of work for some very heartfelt and vulnerable reasons. 2 quotes that really stood out to us were, "This very same shelter I work at, my mother has brought my sisters and I too, and it helped her get on her feet. I learned to walk here. Years later, my sister used to work as an advocate here, and now I do too." And another quote was, "To hold systems accountable for perpetuating violence within the field." While we can't accurately conclude how many survey respondents are survivors of violence, We do know that for at least 60%, their survivorship was an inspiration to the work in the movement. An advocate from California said that most of the people who are drawn to the movement are survivors themselves and or their motives are in the right place. The people are good. There is immense talent and heart amongst our ranks. Some deep connections happen and some real healing happens at the lower levels. If we could bottle that formula, I completely agree. An advocate from Oregon said, because the majority of us are survivors, we truly get what our clients are going through. Things like triggers, disassociation, shame, hypervigilance are not arbitrary to us. They are our lived experiences. So, however, we also know that from personal experience, many advocates are survivors. So when we support advocates, we're also supporting survivors. One specific strength of our movement includes survivor advocates' ability to understand, relate, and provide that support. The second key finding is advocates are doing everything they can to keep working in the anti-violence movement, but it's hard. Advocates love what they do, despite the daily and systemic challenges advocates put up with. They deeply love their jobs and are proud of the impact that they get to make. Many staff are extremely passionate and try to continue to do their best despite hostile work environments, said an advocate from California. Another advocate from Indiana said, I enjoy my job and I hope to stay in it for a long time. But truthfully, at this wage, I recognize that it is likely to become impossible at some point. And then an advocate from Wisconsin said, I'm very proud of the work my program does. My staff are amazing, and I often can't believe that they stick around for as long as they do. We don't have much turnover in our program. We support each other and we remind each other that the work we do is important. And so we asked advocates what strategies they have used to stay in the anti-violence field over the years. And we were given a chance to select, and they were given a chance to select all responses and that apply as well as share other reasons. A little over half of the respondents said that they pursue programs that align with their core values. While this choice is open to interpretation, our intention behind it was that advocates would choose to work at agencies in which the organizational values align with their own personal beliefs. Since supporting survivors and preventing violence is a primary mission of anti-violence agencies, that makes sense to us. An advocate from California shared, as I grew into leadership, the people I work with have been instrumental in my growth and have supported the growth of the organization. I seek out creative opportunities as well as cutting-edge programs and ideas for me and the staff. Working at a learning and training organization has helped me stay with the agency for almost 40 years. And so this is a really good example of how support and opportunities presented by an organization can help people stay in the field. Some advocates have also changed up their roles or organizations to keep working. 36% of advocates selected a change departments or roles within my agency. 34% of advocates selected I worked at multiple local anti-violence agencies, which supports our theory that advocates who have longevity in the movement do not often stay at the same agency the entire time. 16% of advocates selected I moved from a local agency to a state agency or coalition. On a positive note, 28% of advocates selected my organization provides meaningful burnout prevention measures. Examples mentioned included utilizing PTO and mental health days, remote working options, setting boundaries, flexible schedules, and using support systems. Additionally, support from coworkers and supervisors really matter to building up and maintaining advocates within organizations. An advocate from Indiana said, "I love the necessary skills of empathy, understanding, and compassion that tend to come to be common along this field. All of the folks that I work with possess these abilities and use them with clients and with coworkers." An advocate from Ohio said, "Managers, supervisors who share these values have also contributed to longevity for advocates' careers. Feeling the support and validation of any type of injustice seems minute, but it truly is the definition of support." An advocate from Wisconsin said, "At our organization, and I think many other organizations, we are really good at supporting one another and building each other up." This really reiterates what I think a lot of us know, that the support we provide each other and anyone going through or dealing with these challenges makes a huge difference in their overall experience. When asked how long advocates have been involved in the anti-violence field overall, there was a relatively even spread across available categories. Though a little over a quarter of respondents, around 27%, indicated that they have been involved in the field for 5 to 9 years. Interestingly, while 18% of advocates reported being in the field for overall for 15 or more years, only 4% are currently working at or had worked at their job that length of time. So over 55% of respondents have been or had been working in their role for less than 3 years, and just 2/3 of respondents, 76%, had been working in their most recent role for less than 5 years.
This is Jackie. I'm going to just jump in quick. We decided that we need to take a break sooner rather than later to make sure that our interpreter has a chance to rest. And so I think what we're going to do is launch this poll that we have and give folks just some extra time to, give their answers. So I think what we'll do is launch it, which Merlin just did. Thank you so much. And the polling question is, what do you think is the top challenge or reason advocates reported leaving their jobs? So we're going to take about a 4-minute break. We'll be back around 2:45 Eastern time, and we'd love for you to take some time to answer this question. Thank you. Hey, everyone, this is Jackie. Thanks so much for taking that break with us. And thank you for voting in our poll. So I think at this point, we're going to end the poll and share the results, and I will turn it back over to Tatiana.
Hello, everyone. This is Tatiana. So looking at the poll, it seems like most folks voted that insufficient pay was the most challenger reason. So we're going to go and look at what actually the results were. I just get my screen all back together. So it actually turns out that what you all polled is relatively and pretty much close to what came out in the data. So the top 10 challenges that were faced were, of course, that insufficient pay at 69%, experienced secondary trauma, burnout, or compassion fatigue at 65%, 52% said lack of resources, and another 52% said a lack of viable alternatives for clients and survivors. Almost 50% said resistance to addressing internal conflict and ineffective management. 47% lack of transparency from organizational leadership and the boards of directors, as well as bureaucracy and red tape. 42% said a lack of opportunities for promotion. And lastly, 32% said a limited professional development opportunities. 4 respondents specifically commented that despite their best effort, they ultimately had to leave the field. Of those that no longer work at their agency, 1% indicated that they were terminated, while another 4% felt like they were pushed out of their role, ultimately forcing them to quit. One advocate stated, as someone who frequently spoke up about my needs, things that were unclear, unfair, or unequal, always pushing for change, I believe I was pushed out of my organization. I felt like a pawn used to gain prevention education numbers and fill programs. And when I caused too much disruption, they disposed of me and replaced me in a week. Preventionists are people eager for change, but are punished internally for advocating for internal change. And so, just to go back to some of the quotes on the screen is that an advocate from Pennsylvania said, I tried a number of strategies, but had to leave the field due to burnout and organizational trauma. I wasn't able to successfully use strategies to keep me in the field since my organization didn't provide enough support. Personally, I relied on mindfulness therapy and family. I left, an advocate from New York said I left a state anti-SA coalition after realizing that I was experiencing moral injury, not just burnout. I made the decision after my colleague was disciplined and fired for speaking up about abuses of power by one of our organizational partners. And I realized that this same dynamic had occurred 2 years prior with a different partner. I was the 4th person to voluntarily leave this year. So I'm going to pass it over to Dee, who's going to cover leadership and orgs.
Thanks, Tatiana. This is Dee speaking. So our next theme or bucket, as Tatiana said, are findings that have to do with leadership and organizations overall. And the first key finding is that advocates deserve better pay and benefits, and many are struggling to survive. You may remember that nearly 70% of advocates said that sufficient pay was their top challenge or reason for leaving their role. And going into resources and support, what resources or support would make it more likely to stay at your job or would have enabled you to keep working at your job? Advocates were asked to select all choices that applied and had an opportunity to provide other responses. Overwhelmingly, the top 3 choices selected by advocates all had to do with money. The top choice selected was better pay, with over 80% of advocates choosing this option. The second top choice was guaranteed economic advancement, which included an example of consistent raises. And the third top choice was debt relief, which included examples of student loan assistance or help with home ownership. The majority of the other open-ended question or open-ended responses provided were related to funding, pay, and benefits, with advocates asking for additional resources to help afford childcare, higher education, self-care services, and funding to hire enough staff members. On the screen, there are 2 quotes that stood out to us, and I'm gonna just read them really quickly. The pay is too low. The primary cause of stress that results from low pay is the inability to retain a large workforce for long enough time to build trust and understanding between coworkers. There is no faith that anyone will stay long enough to make a difference in workplace culture, and widespread acknowledgement that one's decision to leave is ultimately fully justified, if not encouraged, for their mental health. That was an advocate from Ohio. And an advocate from Pennsylvania said, "This field will continue to see attrition of solid workers until the pay disparities are corrected and we are treated with dignity, care, and respect we deserve." Moving on to talking about furthering the economic divide. While we all need to survive under capitalism, it is made that much easier when our pay reflects the changing cost of living. Wages have not risen, even though cost of living continues to skyrocket. I think we know that the federal minimum wage is $7.25, and it was last raised in 2009. Some states do have a higher minimum wage than the federal one, but quite a few don't, including Pennsylvania, where we live. And wages don't necessarily need to keep up with inflation, but they should be higher, especially given how many of us are survivors and bring lived experience to this role. And if the field is going to continue to become professionalized, as it has within the last few years, then we should be paying advocates what they are worth and the degrees that they got to do this work. The cost of education, like inflation, is much higher than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Many students end up with large debts, especially if they pursue a master's degree. And I think that tends to be the case, particularly for social work students, who a lot of us that do this work are. I myself am not, but I can count on more than 2 hands how many advocates I've met that are social workers by trade. There is also often a huge disparity between the pay of leadership roles and frontline workers, many of whom have second jobs. No person in this field should have to work multiple jobs or forgo benefits to survive. And as we alluded to before, low pay means advocates are focused on survival instead of work, which often leads to burnout, which is an organizational problem, not an employee one. We'll spend more time talking about the lack of pay in webinars 2 and 3, so I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to share another finding.
Thanks, Dee. This is Sarah. So another key finding is that with little to no support from their organizations, advocates are experiencing burnout, secondary trauma, and compassion fatigue. And let's be clear, this is a policy decision. This is an institutional decision, and this is a capitalist decision that prioritizes celebrity and power hoarding of leadership while treating working class staff as disposable. There is a covert and overt abuse of scarcity as a way to make frontline staff responsible for the moral injury of not prioritizing survivors when they demand support to sustain the work. Meaning, that our passion for this work and even survivorship identities is weaponized by leadership when we demand better. Insisting on material support from your employer and serving survivors are not mutually exclusive. So as we can see, 65% of advocates reported experiencing burnout. And that's likely because our movement has depoliticized and decontextualized self-care. The term self-care was born out of the survival programs developed by the Black Panther Party in order for Black communities to seek healthcare at freestanding clinics outside of violent healthcare systems. Self-care was literally about developing assistive programs that kept communities alive in the face of racial capitalism. Self-care as it exists today is about prioritizing individualism. Care is relational, and anything that deviates from that is extractive and capitalist. It provides an opportunity for leadership to shirk responsibility for the hostile conditions they have created. A quote that sums this up is by Nikita Valerio, a community organizer, who said, quote, "Shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people." Burnout is preventable, and that is the good news. Burnout is actually recognized by the World Health Organization, and it is up to employers to prevent it. And we love this tweet by Maggie Levitin. I'm gonna mess up that last name. I am sorry, y'all. Levitiskaya. We're doing our best. Who explains how instead of talking about burnout, we should be talking about exploitation because it redirects our attention to the role and responsibility of employers in preventing burnout. To this end, we want to recognize that advocates are becoming victims of workplace violence through exploitation. And so I'll read these two quotes about creating violence in the workplace. The first is from an advocate in Ohio. Quote, "There is an unwillingness for leadership to understand their role to challenge and change systems or be complicit in the perpetuation of violence. Workers in this field are often exploited for their passion and personal connection to the work, with the onus of burnout maintenance on the individual and not on the nonprofit structures that treat this work as a business, not a social good." And an advocate from New York says, "They perpetuate the violence we are trying to help our clients overcome. It is nearly impossible to advocate for our clients when we are experiencing violence from our agency. It is also gaslighting to pretend that we are not suffering abuse or to put the onus on staff to prevent quote unquote burnout when we are leaving to end the abuse." And these two quotes further emphasize how organizational leadership can be unwilling to take responsibility and make changes that would support advocates. And in some cases, they're even the ones creating violent working environments. And I'll turn it over to Jackie to share another key finding.
This is Jackie. So building off of Sarah's last point, another key finding is that leadership at anti-violence organizations often replicate the same toxic, abusive, and violent environments and power dynamics that this movement aims to prevent. So I will admit, it was truly heartbreaking to read some of the responses that illustrated this point, and there were many. So an advocate from Ohio said, "There seems to be a particular dynamic in the anti-violence field where the workplaces themselves harm workers in ways that resemble the abuses and harms we respond to in our communities." One advocate from Pennsylvania shared, "The system is also failing workers and advocates when we become the victims and survivors of violence in the workplace. Leaders who choose to power play ironically create a hostile and traumatizing work environment within the walls of agencies whose sole purpose is to advocate for anti-violence. We also asked advocates to share challenges that they've experienced or reasons that they chose to leave their job. And as you can see, nearly a third of respondents indicated that they've experienced white supremacy culture or racism at their agency. And we anticipate that this number would have been even higher had we received more responses from advocates of color. Advocates also reported experiencing other forms of oppression, discrimination, and tokenization. And the quote on the screen from an advocate in New York says, "The practice of hiring activists or other social justice-minded folks, especially from marginalized backgrounds, with no plan for how to support them during periods of crisis, trauma triggers, burnout, and moral injury makes it impossible for us to effectively support survivors," which ultimately can impact, the kind of support that the survivors are receiving and making sure that the advocates themselves aren't being re-traumatized. And so we also asked if advocates had tried to hold leadership accountable, and nearly 60% of respondents indicated yes. Advocates who selected yes were then asked to describe the strategies they and their coworkers used to hold leadership accountable. And the primary strategy used by advocates was open communication and feedback, which included conversations with leadership in one-on-one settings or in groups, including staff meetings. However, many advocates indicated that there were no changes made after raising concerns, and some advocates reported being met with resistance, defensiveness, and in some cases, retaliation. The second most common strategy used by advocates was to ask for help from a supervisor, HR representative, or the board of directors. And the majority of advocates expressed not receiving any assistance, were told there was nothing that could be done, or in some cases, advocates experienced clear retaliation from leadership for raising concerns. And the third most common strategy used by advocates was through collective group efforts, including writing anonymous letters to leadership and engaging in unionizing efforts. Advocates who selected no were asked to describe what factors prevented them from holding leadership accountable. And again, the responses mainly fell into two categories: fear of retaliation, or advocates thought it would be unproductive or ignored. And an advocate from Minnesota summed it up by saying, "Our leadership is great at listening, but when it comes to taking action is where the issue comes in." At the SOAR Collective, we've occasionally joked about how ironic it is that leadership at anti-violence organizations can act surprised when advocates actually advocate for themselves. And it seems to be that they think that skill should only be reserved for survivors. And so this dismissal of self-advocacy is not only concerning, but it's counterintuitive to our mission. And so in this quote from an advocate in Pennsylvania, they say, "They are creating harm and victimizing their own employees in the name of helping victims. They're creating more harm in employees' lives while trying to uphold their mission. They refuse to create internal change in a field that is all about culture change. And they hire excited change makers who are given a false perspective of the job and are then let down and blindsided." And so we are going to take another break here shortly. And before we do that, though, we want to ask you to answer into the chat. What is one thing you wish the leadership at your agency would do differently? And again, if you would rather share your answer to just the hosts and panelists rather than everyone, we're happy to read some of those out loud anonymously, because as we just talked about, fear of retaliation is a legitimate concern, and we want to make sure that folks feel safe to share with us. We'll just give everyone another minute or so to think about what they'd like to share. Okay, some of the responses that we're seeing are they wish leadership would be more accessible for direct staff. Also, worship of strong work ethic. Someone shared, I wish I had more transparency from leadership, like sharing and admitting when they're imperfect, but genuine vulnerability, not as a self-deprecating joke. Someone else shared that they wish they would stop pretending everything is okay within the agency. Someone else shared, be more accepting of feedback and not defensive. Listen, believe, and advocate for their staff, which is the same thing they expect us to do for survivors. Someone else wishes we had a less centralized leadership structure. Apply trauma-informed principles to leadership, not just to survivors, and recognize that doing that has to be in direct opposition to capitalism and systems that are in place. Someone said they wish they did more than sit there and inflate their egos. And the last comment I'll read is an earnest examination of power and privilege held by people in leadership. So we're going to encourage you to keep sharing with us. We'll definitely want to use some of these in webinars 2 and 3, and we'll make sure that you are anonymous with anything that you share, unless you're putting it in the chat that goes to everyone. So before we take a break, I'm just going to turn it over to Dee to lead us through a quick exercise.
Thanks, Jackie. This is Dee, and I'm going to take, we know that some of this material has been really challenging to hear, and so we want to offer to lead you in a breathing exercise, but only if you want to, consent. And this is called box breathing. You may be familiar with it. We're going to breathe in through our nose and hold our breath for 4 seconds, then breathe out through our mouth, hold our breath for 4 seconds, and then repeat. And we'll do this a total of 4 times. Since I can't breathe and count at the same time, I'm going to guide you through it. And the instructions are on the slide. All right. So breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. Breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold again, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to do this 3 more times. So breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold your breath, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4, and hold, 2, 3. Sorry, y'all, I saw a message. Actually, we're just going to stop here after 2 times, but this is something that you can practice anytime that you need some grounding throughout the day. And I think now is just when we go into break, right, Jackie? Sorry, I'm a little.
Yes, this is Jackie. We are going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back at 3:15 Eastern time to resume and share the rest of the findings with you. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll make sure that we get to that too. Thanks, everyone.
Can you folks hear me without my headphones?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. This is Sierra. Welcome back. Welcome back. I hope everybody got to wiggle a little bit or breathe a little bit or eat a little bit. So we have a few more key findings to share with you that we want to highlight, and then we're going to dive into questions and answers from you. So we haven't seen many questions, so please remember to submit questions to us. There's a Q&A little button at the bottom of your screen that you can use, and everybody upvote the ones you want to hear from. Let's go ahead and go to our next bucket, which is survivors and data centered around survivors.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I noticed my audio was off. Do you mind repeating that again?
No problem at all. I just welcome people back into the room. I hope you had an opportunity to take care of yourself. And we're going to go ahead and jump into the next bucket of findings, which is data about how we can better support and serve survivors. So let's go to the key finding. So we know our services are not reaching the folks who might need them most. The way our services are set up does not work for many folks, and this emerged in the data. A key finding was that advocates are adamant that traditional service methods are no longer working and that survivors deserve new and innovative services. And there really is some really innovative work coming out right now all over the Midwest. Like I think, actually, I don't know if Rhode Island is Midwest, but Rhode Island rolled out a mobile advocacy, sorry, the East, mobile advocacy with rapid rehousing. Oh, fine, Northeast. They with temporary housing and partnered with community partners like hotels, which I feel like we don't typically think about as community partners. And so if there are Rhode Islanders here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's amazing. And some of this work is now rolling out in the state of Indiana. So let's dive into what survivors said. So one major pattern that we observed from the responses was the desire to move away from carceral systems, including working with law enforcement. An advocate from Ohio noted how it can be traumatizing to work within the criminal justice system, which is an even more important point if we remember how many advocates are survivors themselves. Another advocate from Pennsylvania shared, there's inconsistency among the community with regard to how anti-violence systems should work. Oftentimes, law enforcement is not trained on trauma-informed procedures for dealing with anti-violence cases. They may often become part of the problem by not believing a survivor when called out to a scene. And we see this bear out in communities across the United States. For example, only 13% of survivors who are disabled get victim services, in large part because these cases are not being referred from law enforcement. So not only are survivors not being believed, but people with disabilities are not surviving encounters with law enforcement. Half of all people killed by law enforcement are disabled people. So just because we're working within these systems and how it's been done in the past doesn't mean we can't try new ideas like transformative justice. And we're excited to share more about those ideas in our next two webinars. Not only do we need to move away from systems that re-traumatize survivors, advocates suggested that there needs to be a change as in the services that are available for survivors, including housing, transportation, childcare, and generally helping survivors meet their basic needs so they can focus on healing. And as this advocate from Wisconsin says, society doesn't have enough resources for survivors. And this can be challenging for advocates to continue to do their work when they don't know what solutions to offer or how they can help survivors in need. And the advocate continues to say we can provide emergency shelter, but then what? Where do people go? Sometimes people end up leaving our country because they are unable to find accessible housing and transportation. And you're going to see survivors with disabilities and advocates with disabilities popping up all over this data. And the consistent theme is a lack of things. And so advocates are calling here for change. We are calling for changing the conditions within our communities, in our organizations, and within the culture at large to ensure safety, stability, and nurturing for everyone. So advocates are calling for primary prevention. So let's take a look at that. Meeting basic needs of survivors come up again and again, which really highlights the necessity of creating protective environments, which is a primary prevention strategy. An Ohio advocate shared, housing and transportation are the absolute biggest barriers to my being able to help survivors on their healing journey. And one advocate from Ohio said, we also need better housing resources for survivors. Housing and transportation are the absolute biggest barriers for my being able to help survivors on their healing journey. And they can't focus on healing if they are consistently stressed about a place to live. And some advocates pointed out that this would require funders to have no more strings attached to funding for survivors' needs, and housing that is accessible and open to care attendants and interpreters. I just want to clap on that one. And an advocate from Wisconsin shared that there's no real justice for survivors. And these insights are deeply connected to our advocates' concerns about service innovation and the data about law enforcement. We can go to the next slide. An idea shared by many respondents was the need for more collaboration between agencies rather than fighting over resources and service areas. Instead, we can shift to this abundance mindset that is suggested here in the survivor's quote. An advocate quote, a Pennsylvania advocate said, we must make it more collaborative. Agencies should work with other anti-violence organizations to collectively address all harm and allow it to be more creative and community-based. And resource redistribution really is required to move us to a place where everybody has what they need to thrive. And that really is the definition of reaching health equity there. So some really innovative ideas came from an advocate in Louisiana who said, working with other organizations to teach life skills, environmentalism, financial literacy, cooking, home maintenance, and nonviolence. It takes a village. So many of our clients have a magnitude of challenges and little education or support. We need the whole community to be invested in the success of the population we serve. Advocates know that uplifting entire communities is what it will take to end the cycle of systemic violence that impacts not only survivors and advocates. And we all have a part in that work. So let's find out what you would suggest. This is an opportunity for you to chat us up. We'd like to ask you to offer one innovative strategy that you've used to support survivors. And I'll wait. What are some strategies that you use to navigate some of these barriers that we talked about? I'm not seeing anything. Is there a glitch? That's right. Okay.
This is Jackie. I think maybe we can move on, and if folks want to keep adding to the chat, they can feel free to do so. Oh, look,
Okay.
here's something.
Hey, connected survivors with local urban gardening organization, not solving a systemic issue, helpful in healing. Pod mapping, transformative justice, and community accountability practices. Love that. Okay, why don't you keep adding? We really want to know what you're doing out there that is pushing against what we've been talking about. So, key finding. Survivors should have their experiences centered and be given opportunities to lead and be part of decision making. Means listening. An advocate from Minnesota said, we need to make sure that survivors are the ones making decisions about their healing and their justice seeking. And secondly, we should want to hire survivors to work in this movement. Survivors bring a critical perspective that should be centered and honored. And we're not suggesting that you should not hire non-survivors, but in our experience, some agencies actually prevent people from talking about being survivors or having survivor experiences. And there are real consequences to this kind of professionalism of the field. Like Dee mentioned earlier, actually. So there's consequences for the community too, and for survivor leaders. So let's take a look at some of those consequences. This advocate from Oregon stated current practices are re-traumatizing, and that once survivors begin the professionalization, they face consequences. Survivors reported they felt valued when they were a survivor, utilizing the agency services, but then as they transitioned to volunteer and then unpaid employee, they felt like they were no longer cared for and were pushed beyond their capacity. And they go on to say, we are disposable once we start to work for rape crisis centers because they have an endless pipeline of more survivors who are searching for ways to give their anger and grief an outlet and to create change. And as we've talked about before, each of these things contribute to burnout and people leaving the field in droves, which again, of course, leaves survivors wanting. And so this leads us right back to that compensation conversation and talking about funding and expectations that are attached to funding. If we're going to hire survivors or have them share their stories, we must pay them. While it might feel empowering for some survivors to do this work by giving back, compensation is ethical and it's equitable. It's sustainable. It contributes to longevity. An advocate from New York made a point about how funders need to be less voyeuristic. There's no need for survivors to share intimate details of their trauma for organizations to receive funding. And agencies should take a real stand against this practice, even if it means losing that type of funding. And so we can wrap up this theme with a quote by an advocate from Nebraska who said, true commitment to survivor leadership includes adequate financial compensation for time and expertise. That gave me goosebumps. I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to share our last theme.
Thanks, Sierra. This is Sarah, and I just want to lift up that these connections are being made. And Sierra did such an incredible job of linking what we talked about from the very top all the way through to now our last theme or bucket, which we will keep short because we are going to dive into systems more in webinars 2 and 3. So a key finding from the systems bucket is that advocates expressed that the root causes of violence must be addressed. We must prioritize and invest in prevention and meaningful anti-oppressive practices, which Sierra lifted up considerably throughout the prior bucket, talking about primary prevention and anti-oppressive practices. In addition to anti-racism and prevention efforts, some of the other themes that are related to systems that we'll talk about in webinars 2 and 3 include collaborative community-led initiatives, new leadership that uplifts and centers marginalized and Gen Y and Z voices, disrupting the status quo through adaptation and innovation, and policy change advocacy. So with all of those different offerings, we want to poll one last time to find out what you are most excited to discuss in future webinars. The options you have to choose from are what we just saw on the previous slide. Okay, it looks like we have the majority of folks who have responded. So we'll go ahead and end the poll and share out those results. So as we can see, there is a lot to be excited about. So a lot of different responses to the poll. The one that received the most responses was disrupting the status quo, which I would even say is honestly the things that we're doing and introducing right now, as we haven't necessarily seen a report or a survey that is doing this internal response and giving people a platform to talk about their experiences in the field. So I just want to firstly applaud all of the folks who were able to take the survey as well as be in community with us today as taking that first step in disrupting the status quo. And what you've done in the past in your organizations, whether it felt successful or not, was doing just that. And so we'll dive deeper into that in our future webinars. Some other responses, it looks like our runner-up is new leadership as well as community-led initiatives. And many of these will be kind of wrapped into one another throughout our future explorations. So thanks for responding, everyone. So at this point, we're going to dive into the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we really wanted to leave ample amount of time for folks to ask questions and be able to not only hear from the panelists today, but also what folks might be able to offer in the chat as well. So we'll prioritize questions that have been upvoted. And if we don't get to answer all of the questions, we'll try our best to integrate them into webinars 2 and 3. And so we'll go ahead and stop sharing and check out what questions we have. Okay, so it looks like folks are real-time upvoting. So I'm going to give it just a moment to make sure that we're prioritizing the questions that folks are really wanting to hear about. Okay, we'll start with this one. what are some tools for combating exploitation when traditional bureaucratic routes don't work, such as leadership is non-responsive to staff needs? So we'll drop that also in the chat for folks to see. And I'll open it up to our panelists to give some responses.
This is Dee. I can start. I think it depends on what the particular thing that you're trying to challenge is. I know you're saying exploitation. I think when I hear that, I often think about like being asked to do more work than is probably within your job description, or you have capacity. And one of the things that I've done is, or I recommend, is work slowdown. And that can be hard at times, especially when doing, advocacy work with survivors directly, because you are sometimes like at the whim of, what survivors need. But that might mean you need to turn off your phone. And I think that was suggested earlier, right? If they're calling you to come in, and that might feel bad, but it's also like not fair to exploit staff to respond to survivors, right? Like you're doing the thing that we're trying to stop doing as a movement. So, if a staff member is saying, I don't have capacity, and they've set their boundary and you're going against that boundary, like that's problematic, and you shouldn't feel bad about setting that boundary. That is setting a boundary. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
Go for it, Sarah.
Hello, this is Sierra. Oh, Sarah, would you like to go? Okay. There are a couple of things. The first thing that occurs to me is prickly. And that is that white women need to put themselves on the line to move against what we were talking about, combating this exploitation. And this might mean that you are fired or driven out of your job, but you will most likely find another. I mean, like, I shouldn't say but, because I am not a white woman who, anyway, I feel like I'm talking too much about that. But having the people who are in the majority, who have always led, who are leading us into the ground, are the people who need to move forward and put themselves on the line. The other thing that I wanted to suggest is affinity groups. I joined, so I am a member of the Tumale Nisenan Miwok people, and I joined a national BIPOC affinity group because the one in my state is organized by where I work. And so even though it is an affinity group and it helps the advocates in Indiana, it isn't necessary, like there's still power dynamics there, which is why, like, we are the funder, ICADV, the coalition is the funder, and we have an affinity group for advocates and preventionists. Like, there's still power dynamic, which is why it was so important for me to join a BIPOC affinity group that was not at all related to the coalition. Another thing is, and sort of what has saved my professional, my everything, is joining the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle. It is really, I just got goosebumps. It is really a place where you can fall apart if you need to and be caught by your people. And I did see a question in here about local or regional chapters. So I'll just go ahead and close and pass it on to somebody else.
We're just going to pause for a moment for an interpreter switch. Thank you, Naomi. And I think I'm just waiting to see that Bernice is on and ready to interpret before we move forward.
This is Jackie. I'm getting a message that I'm not sure our interpreter switch is able to happen at this time. Their video will not start. So Naomi, we really appreciate you and all of your work throughout this entire webinar and for making it accessible for everybody. So I'm gonna spotlight again to make sure folks on YouTube or who might be streaming this also have access.
Great. This is Sarah. Thanks so much, all. Thanks, Naomi. This has been, I think, a critical part of what we're talking about as far as being able to create supportive environments for advocates as well. That access piece is so important. So to connect what Sierra was saying as we're seeing some other questions that are linking to this, I first want to pause and make sure that other folks on the panel don't, sorry, y'all. That was my bad. I want to make sure that other panelists have space to respond to our first initial question, which was, what are some tools for combating exploitation when traditional bureaucratic responses don't work? Before moving on.
Hi everyone, this is Tatiana. I just wanted to add to document everything, document what's being asked, document the response that you're getting, because this could be used to, whether it's bringing evidence to the board or other accountability entities that your organization or agency works with, but also if this exploitation leads to you not having a job anymore, this could also be used to help with unemployment benefits and things of that sort.
Thanks, Tatiana. This is Sarah. Oh, and I see Sierra's hand. Go ahead, go for it.
Okay. One of the things that I wanted to say that just occurred to me is there are often more staff than there are leadership, and there is power in the collective. And so like one way that has worked for me, I still left the organization, but what we started doing was saying what we needed all the time. Like in meetings, I need us to stop and take a break. I need us to slow down. I am activated. And if all of the staff start talking about what they need, number one, they know so they can support their fellow staff. But if you are being out and vocal in front of leadership, and there is enough that, like, I feel like there will be enough power to tip the scales. And there's someone there who is going to support you, who has that power. That's just what I wanted to contribute.
Yes, these are such powerful points that I think everyone is making in so many different ways that we can approach these different exploitative behaviors, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach that people can take, and that's based on a lot of different factors. So thanks to everybody for that. With that in mind, this is another way that we can combat those exploitative practices. Tossing this question to the group: is the SOAR Collective, does the SOAR Collective have a local or regional chapter? I would love to discuss how we can organize this work locally or regionally. And I'll also extend that to the MABSC chapters as well.
This is Jackie. I can briefly share on behalf I can briefly share about the idea for local chapters or regional chapters for the SOAR Collective. This is something we've been wanting to do for quite a while. We call ourselves the SOAR Collective because we really do want to be able to mobilize folks to work together. And because we are a small but mighty team, we haven't been able to make that happen quite yet. So hearing that that might be something folks are interested in coming out of this webinar session is something that we would love to start working on. And if others have resources or capacity to help collaborate in that way, we'd love for you to reach out. And I'll also at this point let someone share about the MAVSC as an option.
Hi, it's Joe. I included our brief questionnaire for the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle, and you can also message me directly. I included my email. We are really looking for advocates within the Midwest, and so would love for you to join our small and mighty and growing shining light of advocates that are really advancing some tremendous innovations and are also, really building a community amongst one another.
Thanks for sharing, y'all, and please reach out. We're building more strength as a collective power against a lot of these exploitative practices by being in community with one another. That's a radical act of resistance. So the next one that has been most upvoted is, at what point do we acknowledge that to address the needs of survivors and workers adequately, we must begin to organize towards socialism? We cannot just continue to talk about the failures of capitalism, but organize against them. Yes. Parentheses. Yes. And I want to toss it out to y'all. What are thoughts about at what points are we pushing back against the capitalist system and shifting away from capitalism altogether?
This is Dee. I can chime in. I think in some ways that is what we're doing, although I don't think we're saying it explicitly. I think there's some fear for people to openly say that that is what we're maybe organizing towards, because we have seen what has happened to socialists in the past. They get blacklisted, they are jailed. But that is the risk when you're moving towards revolution. These are some of the things that we have to consider. And I know it's hard because, especially because so many of us are survivors, we've experienced trauma and loss and grief, and it feels scary to take that leap. But also I think because we are survivors, we can do it, we can make it happen. And there was something else I wanted to say, but I kind of lost it. Yeah, I think also just the funding that so much of the funding that we talked about that really is scary in that respect, because the funders are not necessarily going to be happy about us moving in that direction, because I think particularly for folks who maybe work at coalitions or work at national technical assistance providers, with the previous administration, there was an executive order or memo about what terminology we couldn't use. And some of that was like around white supremacy and that sort of terminology, and the anti-critical race theory, like directive. And I think that is still playing out. Like folks are scared because of those directives, and they heard about how other organizations were silenced or told to sort of, fly under the radar. So I think we're still recovering from that administration and then the ramifications that continue to happen now. That was a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, y'all.
This is Sarah, and that was the right amount of words for all of our answers. Are there other folks who want to expand on that or add to the response to this question?
I mean, it's Joe. I mean, I think we also have to challenge our organizations to look outside of state and federal funding sources. And I think at Survivors Know, the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle has explicitly named that we will neither seek or accept funding from state and federal resources because of the tie to carceral systems. And that in many ways is challenging in terms of fundraising, but it also cultivates our own autonomous and independence in terms of really thinking creatively around alternatives to our current systems. And I think, what does that look like? And what does it look like to build with survivors solidarity infrastructure outside of our current systems? It's challenging, but it also is hyper localized. And so I think, these are the things that we're figuring out. And I think if folks would like support in helping to build out those alternatives within their own communities, we would love to be in collaboration with you around that.
This is Sarah. Thanks for sharing, Joe. I'll quickly add too is that in order for us to address the systems that are creating these exploitative practices, we also have to be doing internal political education and also community level political education. We can't expect our coworkers to be in solidarity with us if we aren't also raising collective consciousness around the systems and all the ways that they covertly and overtly impact us every single day. We also have to recognize that screaming unionize at folks trying to survive under capitalism is likely not going to work. We have to build solidarity through so many different streams before we get to the point where folks are willing to risk it all to change things. And we see that when we get to a point of critical mass of we can't go back to this. And so I really encourage folks, let's have more conversations about how we're starting to build trust and rapport with the folks next to us and better understand their material needs instead of us kind of centralizing our own experiences as the reason why we should move forward with a particular approach. If we want to make community level change and societal level change, we actually have to engage in the communities and societies that we're existing under and what everybody needs in that. So I also see that Sierra mentions, I would also suggest folks looking into Indiana disability justice as a successful way with what the person suggested. I can't access the whole, sorry, just doing all of the things, reading all of the things. But we can also drop Indiana Disability Justice's information in the chat as well as an incredible resource because centering folks' needs means making sure that disabled folks are a part of this and centered in this, because oftentimes when we talk about revolution, we don't talk about the ableism that is inherently kind of foundational in revolutionary approaches. So we can all do it. Um, I see a couple of other folks talking about unionizing and how does one unionize. We can definitely tap into some resources. We've got some longtime community organizers and union organizers on our panel. So I just want to uplift that we can reach out and follow up with those answers as well. And we are in the last few minutes. So if we didn't get to your question, we'll do our very best to answer those in webinars 2 and 3. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it back over to Jackie and just thank everyone for your participation and your questions today and your answers. They've been so energizing, and I hope you all feel more of that momentum that we're hoping these webinars will bring. So passing it to Jackie.
This is Jackie. Thanks so much for your questions and to all the panelists for their very thoughtful responses. I'm feeling very inspired. The last few things we wanted to share with you all is that if you're somehow not registered for parts 2 and 3 of our webinar series, we'd love for you to do so and to pass it along to your colleagues. And some quick resources. We've been talking a lot about Survivors Know and the Midwest Anti-Violence Solidarity Circle. But if you would like to, join them, again, we have some links we can put in the chat, and members throughout the Midwest in the following states: Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, and Wisconsin. They would love to have you. And if you're in need of support from other advocates, and you want that to be anonymous, or you can use your real name, you can actually join the SOAR Collective's free Discord chat. And so there's a link here about how to join our Discord chat. And we have so many advocates who are available at all different hours of the day to provide support and lend an ear if you need to vent or are looking for some kind of support. Putting a lot of links in the chat, but one of the last ones here is for a short survey so we can plan for our upcoming webinars. One of the questions actually asks you if you'd like to participate as a panelist. And so if you have something that you'd like to share, we'd really encourage you to fill out that form. And on a closing note, this is how you can stay in touch with us. And if you're able and would like to support the development of the Anti-Violence Advocacy Summit, we are accepting donations that will help make the webinars and reports as accessible as possible. So we just want to express our sincere gratitude and appreciation for all of you today for taking the time to spend with us, and especially to our interpreter, Naomi, and our captioner, Tiffany. And we're really looking forward to working together with all of you in the future to reimagine the anti-violence movement and create lasting change. Thank you all so much.
Naomi, thank you, thank you, thank you.